Today we're talking about the 1920s and 30s, which was a period the countryside really wasn't working for anybody. But against this backdrop emerged some ideas that were intended to pull our landscape and British society into the modern age. And today we meet a main character, Sir George Stapledon. Stapledon was not a farmer, his family were merchants, but he became an agricultural scientist who worked for the government during the First World War, and afterwards he founded the Aberystwyth plant breeding station. And using his position as the leader of a prominent research station, he promoted grass lays, which is the use of grass within a crop rotation, which is better than permanent grass because it's more efficient and helps with fertility, essentially. One of his books has a section entitled Permanent Grass Retards Progress. Agriculturally, that's his contribution. But he's a very interesting chap because he's one of the few people ever on the public stage to truly understand the character of the British farmer. But in this period, he designs a countryside suitable for a modern urban Britain. There are lots of other people who agree with him. Of course, these ideas become the spirit of the times, but we'll focus on Stapledon because he exists in both the agricultural and urban worlds. And the government is prepared to listen to his ideas because the countryside is very visibly rotting during the 1920s and 30s. You're probably getting bored of me saying it, but from the 1870s, Britain imported cheap food from abroad, which undercut British farmers who responded by doing less farming. In the words of somebody alive at the time,
up till about 1935 or 6, the government weren't the least interested in agriculture. All they wanted was cheap food so they could keep the wages of the industrial population down and enable them to produce stuff cheap to export.
But on top of this, you have the Great Depression, and lots of people brought their farms off their landlords immediately after World War I, so from the outset they were saddled with debt.
And a lot of farmers who bought their own land just after the war just went bankrupt, couldn't make a go of it.
And the farmers who didn't go bankrupt went into survival mode. They put their ploughs away and dog and stick farming became more prominent, in which you'd graze animals and the only tools you needed were a dog and a stick. This is a low input, low output mode of agriculture, typically organic in actuality, but it's low risk because you don't need to pay workers, you don't have to plough, sow or do weeding. If you did any work, or in lots of cases even produce stuff for sale, you'd probably make a loss.
You say it was hard to sell the milk?
Actually, it was very hard to sell anything.
This was particularly pronounced in my part of the world, Leicestershire, where landlords encouraged this unproductive farming because it suited their sports.
There was no ploughed land before the war. There was no ploughed land anywhere around here. You could gallop for miles.
So the countryside is falling apart. Barns are becoming derelict and ditches are silting up. There isn't much ploughing and hedges aren't getting cut. But the responsibility for the maintenance and improvement of capital on farms, half of the problem here, was supposed to be done by the landlord. Landlords were supposed to be partners in husbandry, an idea that emerged with the agricultural revolution. But they weren't getting a very good press in this period. Stapledon wrote, "Some good has followed from the breaking up of estates. The man who has become an owner-occupier has freed himself from the restricted covenants inseparable from dual control of the land." Many landlords in this period were also struggling with low agricultural prices and the death duties that we discussed a few episodes ago. But in this period it's accepted that the proper relationship between landlords and tenants as partners in husbandry just isn't working. The agricultural decay was very visible. The drainage was poor and the hedges were messy, but with it came a social decay. The traditional English village community, the idea of which was still central to our national identity, even if most people lived in towns, was also declining as townspeople, commuters, started buying up houses. By this time, farmers are a minority even in the countryside. The weekending townsman comes in and the traditional features of English life, the village cricket, village dances, all start to fade away. And with the rise of railways and personal transport, bikes and cars, people in villages start looking to towns for culture and entertainment. But the urban culture that spread into the countryside in this period didn't mix with farmers. Farming was a very solitary existence.
It was a rough life. Winter time, well, you never seen no one. You wouldn't see anyone, you wouldn't see a vehicle up the road.
And particularly if your farm was outside a village, your world would be very small. It would be very lonely. And being unable to sell stuff, you'd also be very poor, unable to afford stuff like time off or a carpet.
Did your father pay you anything to work on the farm when you were a young man?
I used to get a little bit of pocket money. Wasn't a lot, just a little.
Did you ever get any holidays, time off?
Only if we went to, say, Melton Market with him on a Tuesday. Sometimes if it was a Tuesday not very good, wet, you know. Oh well boy, you want a bit of time off today, you come market with him, you know. You used to go to Melton Market.
These people must have felt forgotten, in a sense. But in contrast to this, agricultural science makes some big leaps forward. In this period, there's lots of hype around gyrotillers and other machines. There's plant breeding, chemicals are developed, and fertiliser manufacture is refined. But most farmers are too poor to make these kinds of investments, or maybe after several generations of dog and stick farming have become attached to it and are reluctant to change. The Welland Valley near Market Harborough was famous for its pastures, for example, so people there didn't want to do anything different. Stapledon noted, agricultural science had definitely outstripped practice. I emphasise that for a lot of farmers this perceived backwardsness had an economic cause, but there was also a sense that farmers were reluctant to learn things.
I really didn't like school. Tell you the truth. I think I've learnt more since I left school.
This is a stereotype, but a lot of people misunderstand it. Stapledon gets it though. It is the habit of the townsman, of the pundit and the arrogant to disparage the countryman and to regard him as slow and unenterprising, which still happens today. But Stapledon argues that the character of the farmer has social utility and they're good citizens. The countryman has taught himself how to adjust to his surroundings, no matter how exacting and how narrow. To the farmer, to see, and only to see, is to believe. And herein lies a splendid and robust mistrust of the printed word and the assertions of the pundit. Stapledon sees that the basis for knowledge in town and country are different. Farmers aren't slow, they're small c conservative, but for good reason. If you try something risky on a farm and it doesn't work, or even just the weather doesn't cooperate, you go broke. So it's much wiser to hold back and not do the risky thing and wait until somebody else has done it enough that you can see that it works.
Farmers, of course, were very much more conservative than they are today, and I don't mean politically. They were very loath to take up fresh ideas, and there was no education given to farmers like there is today. Most of the old farmers were very, very sceptical about these farming from books, as they called it.
There is good reason to be sceptical about a book if the person writing it has no practical experience. I buy lots of books about the countryside and most of them are completely divorced from reality, which we will come to. But the reason Stapledon discusses this is that he thinks a savage rural-urban divide is ripping British society apart, and he wasn't alone in thinking that. Two civilizations exist today, side by side but with minimum contact. Even in his vicarious living, the townsman finds understanding difficult, for his own experience is so removed from the organic life of the countryside. The urban world is of manufactory, of made things. Meanwhile, the organic world of living things, the world of creation, in which the uncertain and the primeval war against man's efforts, the world of time past and time to come, this world is so far removed as to be almost incomprehensible. Townspeople don't get it. They look down on country people. But if the positive attributes of country people are to be preserved and made part of modern Britain, this is a problem that needed to be fixed. But the food system was also failing people in towns. A lot of people were malnourished, and this was accepted as a social evil. A doctor called John Boyd Orr, who went on to lead the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, found that the poorest 10% of the population had diets deficient in every nutritional constituent he examined, and another 9 million people had a diet deficient in all nutritional constituents other than protein. So the people in towns are not healthy, which I think is more of a concern to the government than the situation in the countryside. Another doctor, Christopher Addison, made a big deal of this, and in line with Stapledon's thinking made proposals to redesign the food system to fix the problem of malnourishment and the diseases it caused. But there was also an aesthetic failing. There were 4 million houses built in Britain between the First and Second World Wars, but Stapledon said, "A striking peculiarity of the extraordinary developments that have taken place has been the lack of vision and forethought." His concern was strip development, in which houses were lazily built along existing roads, causing cities and towns to spread outwards like an octopus, which was the imagery they used at the time. This isn't about farming at all. This is about townies destroying their own idea of a picturesque countryside by filling it with houses. But because of this, lots of people who aren't farmers have a lot to say about it. The author J B Preistley said suburbs destroyed the country without conferring the benefits of the town. With our arterial roads and petrol stations and horrible brick bungalows, there are few parts of the world in which commercial greed and public indifference have combined to do more damage than they have here. Culturally speaking, suburbia is seen as hell on earth, a joke for you. One can imagine in a few years the local wits will reply to the question, do you live in the town or the country? Neither, I live in Slough. This sums it up. These people aren't for or against town or country. They're against bad government, essentially. They want good towns where people live in nice houses and have access to open space and live near their friends and work. And they want unspoilt countryside and strong communities and good citizens in both. As this situation was very clearly not working for anybody, there was a very subtle turning point in 1931. The government tried to stem the decay in the countryside by instituting some very limited protectionist measures and promoting agricultural science. The Agricultural Research Council was founded and marketing boards were introduced. The Milk Marketing Board oversaw the production and sale of milk so it could guarantee prices to farmers. Farmers do respond to this and start sending milk into the cities, so there's a little bit of a respite. But widespread dairying didn't mean ploughing necessarily, because you could feed cows on grass. So ploughing continued to decline, and indeed these policies had such a muted effect that between 1937 and 1939, arable acreage in Britain still decreased. And when the government started getting nervous about a second war with Germany, they realised that the farmers no longer had the horses they need to repeat a plough-up campaign like they had done in the First War. So the government had to spend £2.5 million on tractors, which in today's money is over £140 million. And they implement a £2 an acre subsidy for ploughing permanent grassland, along the lines of Stapledon's research and promotion of leys. Point being, the government aligns itself with modern, scientific, interventionist planning before the war, but it doesn't really do much. But the idea was there, and it was quite radical. It was very easy to argue for radical things in this period because you had the rise of fascism in Europe and collectivization in Soviet Russia, and the New Deal in America where they have their little socialist moment. So, in the spirit of the times, Stapledon argued for government intervention and planning. The immediate problem, and it is a long-range problem, is to arrange things so that our limited land surface is used in such a way as to provide the maximum amount of health, pleasure, mental balance and food for our population. This is a progressive urban mindset. They want to preserve the countryside and preserve rural culture, but also preserve urban culture and have the two mix for the benefit of townspeople. Our children must live in a beautiful country. That is something we can all leave them if we fight to preserve it now. It must be a country still happily compromising between nature and man, blending what is best worth retaining from the past with what best represents the spirit of our own age. A country as rich in noble towns as it is with trees, birds and wild flowers. And to do this, they needed to know what they were dealing with. Geographer Dudley Stamp undertook a huge survey of land use in Britain during the 1930s, which he deemed an essential prelude to large-scale planning. It detailed towns, grassland, arable land and woods. It was a start, but Stapledon wanted to go even further, demanding nothing less than a modern doomsday book supported by maps in sympathy with modern requirements. With this information, they would be able to design a truly modern Britain. This would benefit the entire population, but crucially be an environment that would produce good citizens. Stapledon's objective was to improve what he termed the coefficient of ruralicity, the amount of contact city people have with the natural world, or as he termed it, the extent to which they breathe uncontaminated air, the extent to which they eat unprocessed foods, and, for example, the chances open to them of getting a wet shirt in their work or play. The national attitude towards nature in the countryside is, interestingly enough, being fostered in the towns rather than in the rural districts themselves. Witness the rapidly growing popularity of camping, of cycling and of walking. Herein lies the one gleam of hope for a nation that has lost touch with nature and the land. Outside the city wall, provision should be made for an enormous acreage of playgrounds, grounds for the team games. Further afield, golf courses, and farther afield still, weekend villages, camping grounds and national parks. The background, a prosperous and well-ordered agricultural industry and a rural England still essentially rural. He argues for longer work days but a 3-day weekend to ensure that the maximum amount of holiday hours could be spent out of doors. So he wants the preservation of rural culture and communities, but also modernity and a countryside that is actively designed around the needs of urbanites. And these ideas were accepted by the government during post-war reconstruction.
In planning the town, we must take account of the nature of the site. Good communications are essential, railways and roads. Industries should be grouped close together, but people want to live near their work, so the placing of residential areas must be wisely planned. Shopping centres should be well placed in order to save labour. There must be churches, schools, inns and public buildings. We must remember that people need to be near open country. Space must be provided for airfields. Already we've made a start in Britain.
To illustrate his point, Stapledon does something very cute and supplies with his book a map of an imagined national park he designs near his base in Aberystwyth in Wales. My national park, very cute. But national parks don't exist at this point. They don't exist until the 1950s, so he explains. By a national park, I envisage a considerable area of country where facilities are provided for large numbers of urban workers to remain for appreciable periods in the country and amidst truly country surroundings. It must be improved both in the direction of rendering the scenery more beautiful and in affording accommodation to visitors. So this isn't conservative. He would have to build major roads and accommodation for townspeople, which is a move away from the traditional agricultural function of rural communities. He chooses unspoilt country bordered by major roads to give easy access from population centres. He sees that you want dramatic landscapes for walking or riding, but pleasant, gentle, rolling landscapes for driving through, and he situates the roads he plans to build accordingly. Hunting, shooting, golf, cricket, football, tennis, riding, walking, swimming, fishing and bowls will all be facilitated. The main village in his park will have a hydroelectric generator in the river below, and the accommodation will be built in a terrace so everyone gets to see the view. And it would be connected by tracks to other hamlets where people can stay, with stables and ponies available to people wishing to ride them. But he was designing this land to fulfill a role, and that role was beauty, and to that end he planned the vegetation that would be in the park with the same meticulous attention to detail as he planned the facilities for recreation. Although this stuff doesn't happen until after the Second World War, a government commission in 1931 agreed with Stapledon, and Christopher Addison said that national parks were necessary if the present generation is to escape the charge that in short-sighted pursuit of immediate ends it has squandered a noble heritage. But just before the war, in 1938, some green belts were introduced, which was a very similar concept. These were areas around cities where building was restricted to preserve the country for the sake of the town.
Thanks to the preservation in perpetuity of a belt of open space around the city, Londoners have miles of parks and commons, woodlands and hillsides, farmland and fenland for recreation and for rest.
The object of this was social engineering. They wanted to create a modern, beautiful, efficient country supporting diligent, healthy and enlightened citizens. There's lots of talk of citizen scientists, and the national parks were to inspire citizen geographers and citizen biologists. Stapledon said the quality of a human being is to be judged by his usefulness as a citizen. I emphasise this is an urban ideology. Being a farmer in a national park sucks, because if you want to put up a new building to keep your business economically viable, you can't, because you have to keep the countryside looking as townspeople imagine that it should. But Stapledon understands what it's like to be a farmer, and he sees that the country is politically, culturally and economically unable to resist the town. This is why urban development was able to sponge up farmland and townspeople could look down on their rural counterparts. But I think this ideology was kind to rural people. Stapledon could see that town and country were opposed in a culture war that the country could never win. Country people were in danger of being washed out of existence by suburbia. The purpose behind the garden cities, the national parks and green belts was to shape the country to the needs of the town, but also to teach the townspeople to respect and learn from their rural brothers and sisters that they would interact with while holidaying in the countryside. And from that exchange would be produced a modern British urbanite and a modern British countryman, united rather than divided. At this time, these were mostly just proposals. They were just an idea. But the idea was there, and there was some framework in place. Surveys had been undertaken, and the government was looking at protectionist policies for agriculture. It was looking at national parks, and it was looking at green belts. This is an environmentalism. This type of planning is, I think, equivalent or perhaps the root of the people today who argue for 15-minute cities. An emphasis on accessible public transport, access to the countryside, social architecture, an emphasis on science and government intervention over free market capitalism. But above all, foresight. They wanted to create citizens fit for the modern age and build a beautiful country that would endure for generations. I hope you found that interesting. Do subscribe, because we haven't seen these measures implemented yet and you don't want to miss that. In the next few episodes we'll be discussing a different environmentalism that also emerges in this period and has been just as influential in shaping British society, a conservative environmentalism.
To the children, the open country holds a magic promise of adventure. In the fresh air and sunlight beyond the ancient lanes, they can play in a world of their own.